Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to today's event on Omicron boosters and COVID-19 immunity. We have 4 world-class experts today to share insights on this fast-moving variant and what the future may hold for us. I'm Kira Peikoff, and I'm the editor-in-chief of leaps.org, a nonprofit initiative that publishes award-winning journalism about innovation, ethics, and the future of humanity. Our mission is to restore public confidence in scientific innovation and to reckon with the ethical implications of new breakthroughs. Leaps.org is published by Good and Upworthy, and we're grateful for program support from Leaps by Bayer. We're happy to partner with the Aspen Institute Science and Society program for today's event.
I'm Aaron Mertz, and I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Science and Society program, which is part of the Institute's broader Health, Medicine, and Society program. Science and Society was established in 2019 with the mission to elevate public trust in science and to help foster a more diverse and more engaged scientific workforce. The program is grateful for general operating support from Johnson & Johnson, the Rita Allen Foundation, and the Smart Family Foundation of New York. I'm also welcoming the audience on behalf of the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group, which brings together senior leaders across many disciplines to examine some of the most challenging vaccine-related issues and drive impactful change. This event is brought to you with generous support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. The format of the event, if we can put this up on the slide here, we'll be rotating conversations between 2 of our panelists at a time, as illustrated in this image. They will engage with a prompt question and then have a freely flowing discussion for about 15 minutes, at which point Kira or I will come on to say that our time is up. The first speaker will exit and will be joined by the next speaker. The pairings continue until speaker 4 and speaker 1 converse. Then we will bring all 4 panelists back at the end for a Q&A fielded from the live chat, the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and questions submitted in advance during registration.
For our first paired conversation, Eric will interview Theodora. Dr. Eric Topol is a cardiologist, scientist, professor of molecular medicine, and the director and founder of Scripps Research Translational Institute. He's led clinical trials in over 40 countries with over 200,000 patients and pioneered the development of many routinely used medications. And Dr. Theodora Hatziioannou is a research associate professor in the Laboratory of Retrovirology at the Rockefeller University. Her research includes characterization of neutralizing antibody responses in convalescent and vaccinated individuals and evasion of this immunity by SARS-CoV-2. Panelists, please kick it off.
Well, it's great to be joining, and especially great privilege to be able to talk with Theodora. And I guess we should start. There's been so much work on Omicron, Theodora, as you well know, and participated in, on the immune evasion. Its principal property that concerns us, that is the cause of the vaccine effectiveness breaking down somewhat, as well as the reinfection rate. So can you kind of sum up what we know so far about Omicron in the lab?
In the lab, yes. And it's very nice to talk to you too, Eric. I think that our data and data from a great number of labs that have been presented already in various formats all agree and converge into the same conclusion that Omicron is indeed extremely resistant to neutralization. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means it resists inhibition by a great number of antibodies that our body produces following either vaccination or prior infection. And therefore, those interventions or natural infection will not limit its ability to infect us and potentially cause disease. However, there are other responses of our immune system that might be less affected, such as the T cells, that at least so far appear to be rather resistant and not to be greatly affected, at least by the spike mutation seen in Omicron. Certain HLAs, and I'm going into very specific now, might suffer a little bit, but it appears that overall the T cell responses will be largely intact and able to combat Omicron. Now, what does this mean? First, we don't know what the relative contribution of each response is to protection from severe disease. We are really hoping that T cells will play a large role, but we just don't know yet. But it's true also that neutralizing antibodies play a great role in both mitigating severity of disease, but also particularly stopping infection, the initial infection. So I think that it's pretty safe to assume that the initial barrier or the protection against infection is largely eroded against Omicron. And I think that the data that we're getting from all over the world regarding reinfection and infections of people that have been vaccinated largely agrees with this assumption that, yes, Omicron can be transmitted at least easier between people, that even those that have some immunity against it.
Would you say that this remarkable growth advantage, where we're seeing doubling within 2 days, we've never seen anything like this with prior versions of the virus, of course, how much of that could be fueled by the immune escape feature versus true increased contagiousness compared to Delta and prior variants of concern?
That's an excellent question, Eric. I have very strong opinions. I think they are so far supported by data. The majority of the issue is the resistance to neutralizing antibodies. It's the fact that it's transmitted easier is because people that have received 1 or 2 doses of vaccine so far, or have been simply infected, their immune response, their neutralizing antibodies just don't see this new variant. So you can think about it as being back to the beginning for these people. The only people that can really appear to have some activity against it are people that had been previously infected and then got vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine, or people that have received the 3rd booster shot, particularly those of Pfizer. There's less data about the Moderna, although it's coming out now too. So for me, it's the immune evasion that it allows it to infect. And that's why you're seeing this massive the jump, let's call it. So thus far, the trajectory with Delta has been unvaccinated, vaccinated, separating like this. And now you have the vaccinated going back up. Therefore, you see this incredible spread. And I think it's premature to make any claims about transmissibility and where the virus replicates, whether it's slightly higher in your upper respiratory tract or lower respiratory tract. It's a little bit premature to assign significance to these findings. I mean, they are important findings, but we have to wait. And also, one factor that everybody seems to ignore when we're talking about transmissibility is the human compartment. Human behavior plays a huge role in how well a virus is transmitted. So people that maintain measures, wear masks, are going to be far more protected than any countries that drop measures altogether. So it's very important to keep that in mind. It's not all down to the virus. It's down to us too. We play a big role.
You know, I'm glad you emphasize that, Theodora, because, you know, people are not heeding the known ways to block a respiratory virus, which we used in the beginning, right? And now all of a sudden, oh, tight-fitting masks, higher grade, medical grade mask, and distancing, and all these things that we know work, ventilation, air filtration. So very important. You alluded to the Hong Kong report, which is an interesting one that shows the ability for Omicron to reproduce 70 times faster in the upper respiratory tract, but not in the lungs. Now, that perhaps goes along with the idea that everything comes down to the T cell, as I call it, the last line of defense. If that holds up, the issue here that we don't know, it's still a debate, is about the severe disease. And what are your thoughts? You mentioned the T cell, the epitopes, the binding sites are very similar to the prior versions of the virus. And as we learned so far in these 2 years, that T cells are much less affected by these variants. Do you think we're going to see that our T cell memory is going to hold up very well against Omicron, and the hospitalizations and the serious illness will not be the problem?
It's hard to say. I want to think that way, but we just have to wait and see. As far as I'm aware, and I don't know, maybe you know this better, I don't recall any specific examples where T cells by themselves have been shown to be sufficient to completely to provide protection in the absence of other responses. But it is a complicated issue to address. I mean, I know we like to separate it, but our immune system works together. It doesn't make these distinctions that we do. So as I said, we will find out what exactly contributes to protection from disease. The other thing, though, I'd like to point out is that people that have received, that neutralizing antibodies are not out of the picture. So as our studies and other people's studies have shown now, that the third booster shot makes a huge difference in improving neutralizing antibodies. And that cannot be only attributed to their levels. They must have matured in order to see Omicron so well. So the third boost doesn't only boost levels, but it also helps your antibodies become better, become able to see more diverse spike and also target Omicron. I think this is extremely important and suggests that, yes, the third dose is going to help, because even if those antibody levels wane, your memory response is now much better, also in terms of antibodies. So it potentially will help with dealing with severe disease.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. People always think about just levels and not the breadth of being able to recognize binding sites to achieve neutralization. And so the more diverse breadth of response is obviously better. But just get back to this T cell dependence, because as just to emphasize that the infection story is much more tied to neutralization, but the pneumonia and other organ involvement is tied to our T cell memory. Now, when we gave the vaccines initially with the 2 doses of mRNA, we used very minimal spacing, and we may not have achieved the best memory. Whereas now with the booster, we have lots of spacing, like many months of spacing. But also countering that, we have the issue of immunosenescence, where the age you don't get as good a T cell response. Can you comment about the spacing now with the 3rd dose? And also, are there people that are aged or have some type of immunocompromise? Are they going to be the ones where we see the breakdown of this T cell story?
I mean, so first of all, immunocompromised people is a very difficult story. And as we said, all these responses are so interconnected that I don't think we can pinpoint to one and say, if this breaks down, that's it, you're game over. So it will be difficult. And I'm really not worried. I feel bad for these people, because at the moment, there's not a lot we can offer them. Mm-hmm. So regarding, and sorry, I forgot, what was the first question?
Well, the story of age with T cell and spacing.
The spacing. Yeah. So here is the problem. Yes, there's been a study, at least studying, or a couple of studies, I think, studying spacing the initial 2 doses at different time points, yes? But it's a small number of people. And there is a small improvement in the antibody responses, but it's not that great. And it's not as big as I would like it to be. The problem is, though, Eric, that we can't experiment at the moment. We know that the 3rd dose is going to provide a great improvement in our protection. So we can't really risk waiting, can we? I mean, it's a dilemma that I think is very, very difficult to address, because the problem with spacing doses, particularly the 1st and the 2nd, is that after your 1st dose, your antibody levels are not really that great. So
Right.
you have this space, this time where you have suboptimal antibody levels and you are vulnerable to infection. And that is not a good idea if you want to avoid further accumulation of mutations in the spike.
Sure. Well, yeah, what I'm getting at is more that I'm trying to be optimistic that the 6-month or 4-month, whenever somebody gets the 3rd shot, that the T cell memory boost there could be better than we got from the 2nd shot.
Oh, yes. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. Yes.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yes.
I mean, fingers crossed, but we don't know. We'll see. And maybe that's going to be an issue for the people over age 60 who have had a particular vulnerability to hospitalizations and fatalities along the way here, and then maybe that'll give them an extra layer of protection from vaccination. Now, one other question I want to ask you, if we have time here, is that transmission is a big concern with respect to the spread that's happening so rapidly in the UK and Denmark and already in New York City and other parts of the US. The issue here is that when a person has been vaccinated, they've now got Omicron. What we saw with Delta is that the clearance was very rapid. Those people who were vaccinated, they cleared it so that it wasn't this 10-day need for isolation. What can we do about Omicron so that we don't have, for example, healthcare workers that can't get help to look after the sick? Do you project that it will be a fast clearance in people who've been vaccinated? And shouldn't we get that answer quickly so that we know and not have to have all these people, particularly the frontline healthcare people, so that they're not sent home for 10 days or longer with an inability to help care for patients?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. We should get the answer as early as possible, but I would hate to speculate without having any data whatsoever and say, you know what, send them back after 5 days, they will be fine, and then find out, but you know what, they transmit. And the problem with these estimates is that you're usually lying on the average. So yes, it is 5 days, but in some people it's actually 14, and other people it's less. So you always have to find the perfect balance, and that's very difficult to do, and it requires time, and it's time that we don't have. So those are very difficult questions to answer, I think, and we should be very careful when suggesting things change.
Right. No, it's already starting to come up in places that have been hit hard with Delta, and now the health resources are strained with the start of the Omicron surge. So a significant question that's unanswered yet, but I hope that we'll get some data, because we don't want to rely on just PCR there. We actually need to know about viral load and assessment of true capabilities of if transmission is just 2 days, that would be great, but we don't know that yet. Now, I guess one of the things that attracts me is that up until now, our entire approach to Omicron and the pandemic has been trying to leverage our immune response, whether that be with vaccines or with the monoclonal antibodies. Now we have a small molecule that takes out the main protease, Paxlovid, of the virus, and it works quite well against Omicron. Why aren't we shifting or adding, complementing, and making this the #1 priority of having a whole auxiliary way to combat the virus, besides, as you say, human behavior central, taking advantage of our immune response through vaccine-induced immunity, or if it occurs, infection-induced immunity? Why aren't people as excited as I am about a whole new approach?
No, I'm very excited. I think scientists are very excited, but these are not decisions that are up to us. I think it's up to the administration to do something. I agree with you. We need to, vaccines are definitely a great weapon, because they don't only treat you, they protect other people too. They protect long-term. It's a different approach. But yes, antivirals are extremely important. And if we have one that works, yes, we should try and get it produced or distributed as much as possible, not just to the US, but other countries too.
Absolutely.
The problem is that it takes a little bit of time to develop antivirals. And my concern is when we have a single one, is that resistance might arise, and then where are we going to be? Having experience with HIV-1, we know that we need multiple antiviral drugs to be as effective as possible.
Sure. Well, at least here, HIV is a hypermutating virus, and hopefully, the coronavirus it's bad, but nothing like HIV. We'll have to see it. We're talking about the MPRO part of the virus that is now only one mutation since the ancestral strain, which is reassuring. But that caveat you're bringing up is an important one. Last point: the monoclonal antibodies, the Regeneron and Lilly and all these antibodies, they don't work
That's true.
Except for one from Ver. And we don't know when a person is a candidate for monoclonal, which type of virus they have, unless it's sequenced. This to me seems like the dawn of virogenomics. What do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, that's, again, the problem is that you want to treat them as soon as possible. And do you have time to wait until the sequencing comes back and to figure out? I think the one antibody that is still effective, the VO1, is not the most potent one that we had in our arsenal. So that's also a little bit of a problem. Single antibody therapy for me is also dangerous because again, you're going to select for resistance. And this is spike, so we know it can mutate to avoid antibodies. So you know you're going to have mutations that are going to come up. So basically, the take-home message, I think, is that our antivirals game is not up to scratch.
No. And this also supports what we spoke about at our beginning of our conversation, that this is a very different antigen. And the monoclonals just have a hard time. The other thing just to point out is that this particular antibody that has some effectiveness is in short supply, very short supply. So we have a problem here, not that we don't have other problems. All right.
We need to wrap up this pairing, so we'll move on to the next. Thank you, Eric. We'll bring you back for the fourth conversation.
Thank you.
And now Theodora will interview Onyema. So let me get...
Okay.
Yes, 1 second. Great, thank you. Dr. Onyema Ogbuagu is an associate professor at Yale School of Medicine and an infectious disease specialist who treats COVID-19 patients and leads Yale's clinical trials around COVID-19. He ran Yale's trial of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and you two will talk for about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Onyema. It must have been very exciting to be involved in such a clinical trial.
Oh, absolutely. Hi, Theodora. Yeah, I mean, it was a time where we were just looking for a highly effective, prevention modality for COVID-19. And I think I speak for everyone else, on the investigative team that if we had to line up our expectations on what the vaccine would be around what, safety and efficacy, and if we even put our most optimistic estimates, I would like to think that that has probably been exceeded. So yes, it's a great thing to have been a part of.
Yes, that's great. So I thought maybe we should start by actually defining what we mean when we say real world vaccine effectiveness and how this relates to infection versus protection.
Yeah, great point. So I think there's been lots of mischaracterization of what some of the numbers mean, especially the percentages. So, the way the clinical trials were designed, we looked for the incidence rate of, symptomatic COVID disease in people who got the vaccine versus those who got a placebo. And so the readout on the results, especially for vaccine efficacy, was really like a relative comparison, the incidence rate between those who got vaccinated and those who didn't. So that when you hear about 95% efficacy, for example, that really means a 95% reduction in incidence in unvaccinated compared to those who were vaccinated, and not the commonly misused term, which would suggest that 95% of those who get a vaccine will be protected against symptomatic disease. So that's really important to highlight and helps us interpret it better. And of course, there are sometimes differences between the clinical trial designs, between different studies, so that some looked at much more severe spectrums of disease, while some looked at all comers with symptomatic infection. And then really important, again, is paying attention to efficacy as it regards to infection rates, which is without prejudice. So do you have a positive test without prejudice to having symptoms or not, and different from endpoints that have looked at symptomatic disease. So paying attention to that. And let me just add that, as we go into thinking about the real world data is, I think that, the COVID vaccines are being held to a high bar, in my opinion. I think the current expectation, just by, hearing just the sentiment around the expectations around the vaccine, are that we have COVID vaccines that prevent even, asymptomatic infection, primarily because of the risk of transmission and severe disease. And this is not the same standard we hold for, let's say, an influenza vaccine, for example, which we continue to tout what is not an insignificant and a meaningful clinical benefit, which is preventing against, severe disease, hospitalization, and deaths. And so I think, that as a community, we need to, especially as we have much more highly transmissible variants like Omicron, right, that can establish infection, albeit what appears to be mild disease in the majority, we need to decide, and if the vaccines are holding up well against hospitalization and deaths, especially in the context of vaccine shortages and limited availability, I think we need to think a little harder about what our expectations are for clinical benefits for the vaccines.
I agree that we need to be very precise, particularly when communicating to the public, because the public hears protection and assume they will never get infected because they had the vaccine. And so the other point, of course, is that a lot of the studies are looking at this very shortly after the last dose, shortly after the second dose, shortly after the third dose. And what happens over time, and how can we best communicate what we are seeing so that people don't accuse us of lying about vaccine effectiveness?
So the way the clinical trials were designed, as we all know, right, we're supposed to run for 2 years. But, when you do a placebo-controlled trial and you see overwhelming benefit in an intervention arm, then it becomes unethical to follow people along. At some point in the Pfizer trial, we wanted to follow a group of people who were eligible, who got vaccine and maybe have been eligible for booster and didn't want to receive it or so that we have much more longer follow-up. But that can be very difficult. But the way those are assessed is really just to follow the cohort for longer periods of time, characterizing both their immunologic decay over time as well as the clinical endpoint, which is a symptomatic disease. And that's how we've been able to learn about some of the issues around declining protection from the clinical trials as well as real-world evidence around data around both antibody decline as well as its real clinical impact, which is people getting infected with COVID-19. And I think it's going to be an ongoing question, especially now with the boosters, right? So in the Pfizer trial, for example, we then took a subset of people in the original trial and boosted some and didn't boost some. And that's where we showed that 96%, right, reduction in symptomatic COVID for those who got boosters compared to those who didn't. And then now everyone's going to get boosted and then we'll follow people along. So I think one of the big questions that the public has, and I don't really have an answer for yet, is will we continue to need boosters at what interval? So is it going to be 6 months from now? Is it going to be 1 year? It's hard to, and of course the curveball here would be, if we have another variant like Omicron that evades quite significantly the immunity that's conferred by some of these, that will be an issue. But I just want to highlight, and I think Eric had mentioned this, right, about, you guys have talked about the role of T cells here. I think one great thing about the T cells, and I do agree that the neutralizing antibodies are playing that greater role, and we clearly see a relationship between declining levels and clinical susceptibility. But the T cells tend to be a little more, have probably greater breadth, if you will, with regards to being able to neutralize different variants. And who knows what the boosters will do to that important arm of the immune system and how that could offer cross protection in the future for other variants. So I think it'll be interesting not just to look at the immunology of things, which is exciting, but also hopefully gather some clinical data as to when individuals become susceptible again to infection.
Absolutely. So would you favor that, let's say we come to the fourth dose, that would be done with the same antigen or one based on Omicron?
That's a hard question to answer. I think what we've seen, and we saw that with Delta, right, is that, again, once you're able to get antibody levels up, it offers protection against quite a broad swath of variants. And I think that's why I think the sentiment now is that we probably don't need an Omicron specific booster. But then again, we don't know what's coming ahead. And that's definitely something that we need to think about. And I know that there's a lot of race to try and identify vaccines that have even more breadth for, but arboreal viruses and others. And I think that maybe those approaches may be able to offer at least, cross protection, but those are kind of, months to years down the road.
Yes, that's true. So and the other question is that a lot of the studies that we've seen, and a lot of for me at least, the majority of the data are focused on the vaccines that are used in our part of the world. So the mRNA vaccines, a little bit on Johnson & Johnson and maybe AstraZeneca. But what do we know about vaccines used in the rest of the world? And particularly when you're considering boosters, what do we combine, and what do we advise? Can we advise people to do?
Yeah, so I think that's a data gap, frankly, about, we know there's a lot of work on mix and match, both for primary series and I think ongoing booster studies. Some exciting mix and matches will be emerging soon. For example, Sanofi with the adjuvanted protein is doing a booster study for people who've received primary series of other vaccines, and we'll hear about that. And so for some of the Chinese vaccines, we don't have, some of that data, and those are used by not an insignificant number of countries around the world. So I think that we need to continue to generate some of that data as to, what combinations work best for people.
Yes, yeah, agreed. That yes, you're absolutely right. There's a big gap in what we know. We do tend to focus in what is close to us. I think that's that's expected. So, in terms of boosters, so I know we touched on it a little bit, but what would your ideal scenarios? Of course, we have to wait and see what's going to happen and how long, whether the third boost is enough or whether an additional booster is going to be. But what is your ideal scenario? Would you imagine that it would become like the flu vaccine, where we have to take a booster every year, or maybe shorter interval? What do you think about this?
I've kind of been a little discouraged lately with Omicron, and just, how, a variant has really upended a lot of things. And I think clearly people who receive primary series don't really have that much protection, across different vaccine approaches. And so, obviously a booster is, very much needed to be able to address that. And so I think there's many variables there, but, my sense is that, immunity will still continue to wane even after boosters. Again, I think, lumping everyone together also is something that we don't always need to do, because there are people who, will get a booster and not respond to it. And we know various immune compromised groups where that will be the case. Pretty sure the trajectory in the elderly may be very different from younger adults with no comorbidities, as against even kids, etc. So part of the work that we need to do, and I think should always be done with the boosters, is to identify, not just using broad strokes, but identify which subsets of patients need boosters, and maybe boosters earlier than others, to maintain this robust immune response to protect them against infection. Mm-hmm.
And so, exactly, talking about several subgroups, so what would you recommend for kids right now? I know some categories have just started getting vaccinated in many countries, but in view of the data and in view of the fact that 2 doses are just not enough to deal with Omicron, should we be extending their recommendation for booster shots to kids, or?
Yeah, so the clinical trials will play out. I think Pfizer just released a press release today around suboptimal immunogenicity for kids within the 2 to less than 5 age group. And that was a group that received 1/10 of the dose of the vaccine. So, clinical trials have been and will continue to be important to assess, if the immunogenicity is what we expect, which is a decent surrogate for how much clinical protection will be expected. So, and then on the flip side, our Pfizer data as well. So for kids aged 12 to 15, we still saw almost 100% protection 4 months after receiving the vaccine. And that group received the same dose as adults. And also had some of the highest levels of antibodies we measured across the study, comparing them to other groups. So, let's see how the data plays out. But, my sense would be, at least for the 12 to 15 demographic, based on just what's happening with clinical outcomes, maybe not necessarily needing a booster at 6 months, maybe that could go out to a year. But clearly, we need to go back to the drawing board for younger kids regarding to just the right amount of vaccine antigen. So I think booster doses probably will be offered to 2 to 5 year olds within the clinical trial. Of course, then many months down the road, depending on what the results are, to be rolled out to to younger kids. So that's a little bit of a setback, I must say, for younger kids. And, I think Pfizer was ahead with the evaluating the vaccines in kids. So a little bit of a disappointment, but that's what science does. And that helps us identify what works and what doesn't work.
Yes, I think we've been quite lucky that everything has worked so well in the past, and now we have a result that's not quite what we expected, and it feels very bad. But I think it proves how well vaccines have worked so far, as you pointed out in the beginning, that we're really very fortunate to have these tools in our arsenal against the virus. So it's and of course, vaccine equity around the world and access is another problem. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we could possibly address that.
Yeah, I think most of us have struggled with, having two things. One, having more than enough vaccines for an entire country, over, 2 times or 3 times over, while many parts of the world are under-vaccinated, including my beloved continent of origin, Africa, where I don't know if it's 7% now continent-wide, although there's variability between countries. And I think with Omicron looming, I think that, even with decreased disease severity will impact the toll on those individuals. And we have to acknowledge that the global demand and supply, especially the pull from richer countries, buying up these vaccines definitely has led to a shortage globally for vaccines. I think, there was a goal of vaccinating about 40% of the populations through, WHO mechanism by 2021, and I think about 70% by mid-22. I know there's a couple, 600 or something million doses shortfall for even to meet the 2021 targets. So, and then, what greater lesson than Omicron to remind us that if we have under-vaccinated parts of the world, that's just the perfect milieu for a variant to emerge, and how they can then upend everyone, right, regarding their, pandemic control. So I think the lesson is there. And if we don't learn it from Omicron, then we lose something as a global community.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you both for that conversation. And Theodora, we will bring you back at the end for the audience Q&A. For now, for our third paired conversation, Onyema will interview Dr. Céline Gounder, an infectious disease specialist and epidemiologist at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and Bellevue Hospital. She's also the host and producer of American Diagnosis, a podcast on health and social justice, and Epidemic, a podcast about infectious disease epidemics and pandemics. She served on the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board. And you'll have about 15 minutes for this pairing.
Hello, Céline. Good to meet you, and happy to send some questions your way. So as you know, Omicron is the latest variant that's circulating. And I think if we go by what's happening in South Africa and places in Europe, and even in places in the United States, states like New York, which are epicenters of the new variant, I think people are very concerned. And I think, really reminiscent of some of the tougher times in the pandemic. And so, of course, one of the most potent approaches we have to protect against Omicron is vaccination. And of course, trying to get people, those unvaccinated, vaccinated, and those vaccinated to get boosted. And then people are asking questions, right, about vaccines for Omicron. And, should we, again, following up on the question I was asked as well around, should we continue to find variant specific vaccines, or maybe approach it from a much broader way, anticipating that we will, for future variants may emerge. So what's your thought on that?
With respect to updating vaccines as we have more variants?
Correct.
Yeah, so I think one of the promises of the mRNA vaccines is that theoretically they are easier to update. You're really talking about updating the genetic sequence specifically for the spike protein, and that once you're able to sequence a new variant, you're able to update the code for your vaccine fairly efficiently and quickly. In terms of switching out production with respect to a new vaccine, it is perhaps more straightforward than for other vaccines, but it is still a time-consuming endeavor where you do have to switch out manufacturing capacities to now manufacture an updated vaccine. There are regulatory steps that you need to go through. So with the FDA, for example, although the FDA has said that this would be more of an expedited process, where just like the flu vaccine does not have to go through a phase 3 randomized clinical trial every year when we update the formulation for that year's flu vaccine. Similarly, we would be looking at neutralizing antibody endpoints and surrogate endpoints in approving an updated COVID vaccine. But I think we're also looking at what does this mean for rollout operationally, logistically around the world? Will the updated vaccine also protect as well against prior variants or other currently circulating variants? So for example, if you were to update for an Omicron vaccine, how well would that now protect you versus Delta, which as we know, at least in the United States, remains the dominant variant, although Omicron may outrun it before too long. So I think those are some of the questions that many of us are concerned about. With respect to Omicron as well, it does seem that, as you know, giving an additional dose of the currently available vaccine, which is really against the original Wuhan variant, does seem to both increase the levels as well as breadth of the antibody response and memory B and T cell responses. And that may be adequate, at least in the near term, to address the emergence of Omicron. And then by giving third doses, we're essentially buying ourselves a bit more time to better assess whether Omicron will become the dominant strain, whether it is necessary at some point down the line to update our vaccines. So, I think there's a lot of things that go into it. With the beta variant sort of as a counter example, which was also an immune evasive variant, that ended up being really more localized with respect to transmission. It did not come to dominate around the world. There were efforts made to update the vaccines should we need a beta variant specific vaccine, but that ended up not being necessary. And I think similarly, we'll have to see how this plays out with Omicron, whether updates are necessary. But at least based on what we're seeing right now, it does not seem like that is necessary. We just need to be prepared if it is.
Great, that was a great response, and I'm glad that you covered the process by which given an example with influenza vaccine, for example, how they can be updated year to year to address that, and how at least we have the potential to do that expeditiously for COVID-19. And thanks to some of the newer vaccine technologies, which can be tweaked much more easier than some of the historical platforms. And I think that that's moved the needle positively with regards to just COVID, the lessons and we've learned from COVID vaccine development. And then another question I'm sure a lot of people have is, the predictions are it's going to be a tough winter. We're still in the Delta wave, and clearly very soon Omicron will become the dominant strain with a spike in cases, although most of us hope that with the advances in treatments and the fact that, we have more people vaccinated than previous times, that hopefully it will not be as lethal. But I guess one thing that will still occur is, again, just all the things we've been doing from a public health standpoint to reduce community transmission, right? So which includes things like lockdowns or quarantines, school shutdowns like has occurred in a couple of colleges and everything. So people are now beginning to wonder, when would things ever get back to normal? When do we no longer have to pull the trigger for these uncomfortable public health interventions? Is there a rate of hospitalizations or infections? What should we be looking for? What is that metric where we can at least relax and hope for, quote unquote, return to normal? So just what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think that is so much of a social or values question as much as it is a science question. If you take a other viral respiratory infections that we've been living with for some time. So for example, influenza or RSV, if you look at how many hospitalizations, how many deaths we cope with, we've gotten used to, we've accepted with a bad year with flu and RSV, you're talking about 35,000 hospitalizations per week across the country and about 3,000 deaths per week across the country. And just to put that in those numbers in perspective, at the beginning of December with COVID, so before really this Omicron wave had taken off and is taking off, we had at that time 50,000 hospitalizations per week and over 7,000 deaths per week. So we were already above in December, our cumulative COVID hospitalizations and deaths for the week were more than what you would have, about twice as much as what you would have from flu and RSV combined. And of course, those are not going away. So now you're looking at flu, RSV plus COVID. So the question is, are people willing to bear that cost, that level of hospitalization, that level of death? I think, unfortunately, people do seem to have accepted 1,000 deaths per day of COVID. We've been living with that for months now, and that seems to be a cost people are willing to bear. But I think that's really what's going to determine at what levels of hospitalization and death we start to re-implement certain measures. I do think if we are looking at a new normal, where as a society, that is what we have decided, that we are looking at 50,000 hospitalizations a week, plus RSV and flu, healthcare systems are not, they don't have the capacity to keep handling that level of disease. And so that will mean reversing the clock on what we've seen over the last couple decades in terms of shutting down hospitals, downsizing hospital beds, downsizing hospital staff. It would mean rebuilding up that capacity in order to observe ongoing disease. And I don't think people have fully understood what the true costs of that would be with respect to Medicare, Medicaid funding, with respect to your insurance premiums, with respect to your taxes. And I do think there is a stronger case to be made from a financial perspective, public expenditure perspective. Is that really what we want to be doing, dealing with COVID on the back end with the healthcare system and caring for patients? Or would it make more sense from a public expenditure taxpayer perspective to deal with this on the front end with more vaccination? And I don't think people are thinking about it in those terms. I think they're thinking about it in terms of, well, the impact right now is something I can live with. I think the other thing that we saw in the past week with some of the data that CDC released, so we've hit in the United States now over 800,000 deaths in this country over the course of the COVID pandemic. But those have been concentrated in very specific populations. 3/4 of those deaths have been in people 65 and over, and people of color, specifically Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people in this country have been at have had twice the risk of death from COVID as have other Americans. And so that's quite significant. There are communities where they really just don't feel like this has really touched them, because in some ways there has been a degree of segregation in terms of who has been impacted. And so I think that is also driving some of the attitudes that you're seeing with respect to what people are willing to sacrifice to reduce transmission or not.
Yeah, great point. And I agree that there's multiple considerations in regards to what our appropriate public health response is. And I totally agree they have to be customized and tailored to different patient populations, different settings, rather than just blanket recommendations. I think that that's really important. I want to get one last question in, and I think this is a question that I'm sure just the individual on the street has. So we've talked again, pushing for boosters. You're right. It seems that when people get boosted, they have restored or at least good protection against Omicron. And we already started to have real world data on how well the boosters can protect against that. I think data from the UK suggests that those who got AstraZeneca or Pfizer priming, who got a Pfizer booster, had about a 70 to 75% protection against infection. So if I'm fully vaccinated and I got my booster, you know, what am I allowed to do and what am I not allowed to do? I mean, can I go back to what I used to do when I got my primary series and relax some of the recommendations? Or are we more concerned about Omicron, its transmissibility, the fact that if you could be infected, you could transmit that to someone else, you know, and get them sick? Do we just lose all those, what I say, perks of, you know, now receiving a booster? And I guess another group would be people who are newly vaccinated, right? Who are just getting their primary series now. What do you think?
Well, I think, you know, some of this data is anecdotal, but certainly in New York City, the numbers of patients, the numbers of colleagues I have who have been fully vaccinated and have received their third dose. They are more than 2 weeks out from their third dose, but not that far out from vaccination, who are now having breakthrough infections, presumably with Omicron. It is quite high. They are not having severe symptoms. These are quite mild breakthrough infections, really like the common cold. But that does seem to be what we're dealing with right now with Omicron. And so I think the idea that even reboosting multiple times would get you to sterilizing immunity to prevent all breakthrough infections does seem to be unrealistic, at least at this stage. And so then the question is, what is safe? What is safer? How do you ensure that? I think it's a win that the vaccines are so protective against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. But if what we want to do is prevent more, you know, a larger proportion of the transmission of the infections, it is going to mean layering additional interventions. We have seen, though, that people who have breakthrough infections are less likely to transmit onward. That's likely for a couple different reasons. Partly because they're viremic for a shorter period of time, so they have less opportunity to transmit onward. And the virus that's being picked up by PCR is not necessarily replication competent or infectious virus by viral culture. So, you know, I think even if people do have breakthrough infections, they probably are much lower risk for transmitting onward. But I think if what we want to do is further suppress transmission, we do need to layer other interventions. And I think thinking about, in particular, the elderly, other vulnerable populations, I think we do need to be alert to the fact that what might be a threat to ourselves in terms of our health may be a very different calculation for some of those other groups, and to factor that as we think about when to make use of other non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Great. All right, I'm told I can throw in one more question, so not to put you on the spot. So I think a lot of people are asking, you know, you remember earlier on when we had the viral vector vaccines and both mRNA vaccines, get what you can, you know, that you know, whatever you get is going to offer you good protection against that. But I guess and now we know what, you know, what has been said about the J&J vaccine, for example, more recently. So as people are lining out to get their boosters, do you have a thought on what your advice would be, you know, mRNA versus viral vector vaccine, and what will be your considerations around which one to pick?
Yeah, the data on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine versus Omicron is not great. It really does not seem to be providing adequate effectiveness. And so at this stage, if you got a single dose of Johnson & Johnson, I would strongly recommend people get either Pfizer or Moderna for their second dose, for their booster. I do not think the Johnson & Johnson vaccine should be taken off the market per se. I know there's also some concerns around blood clots, for example, particularly in women under the age of 50, but we do need alternatives for people who, for whatever reason, perhaps an allergy to polyethylene glycol, for example, who for whatever reason cannot take Pfizer or Moderna, at least in the interim until we have perhaps protein vaccines like the Novavax vaccine approved. But until then, I do think we need some other options. Whether some of this might also entail updating the J&J vaccine, I don't know whether that'll be worth the investment or not. I think there's a lot of decisions to be made. But in any case, if you got a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think the data is pretty clear. You should be boosted with either Moderna or Pfizer at this stage.
I agree.
Thank you so much. We're now going to bring Eric back for our fourth conversation, and then we will have Q&A for all the panelists.
Oh, I get to speak with Céline. This is a great treat, really.
It was great to see you, Eric, and great to be here with everybody. Before this panel started, we were all chatting a little bit about the antiviral drugs that show a lot of promise, haven't really been integrated into the response yet, in part because molnupiravir, the Merck drug, has just received emergency use authorization, and there are some issues with the Merck drug. And then the Paxlovid Pfizer drug has not yet received that emergency use authorization. How do you anticipate, Eric, that we will incorporate each of these drugs into our response, and what might the impact be?
Right. Well, I do think this is the biggest thing that's happened since vaccines in the pandemic in terms of a way to deal with the virus. I don't think there's much for the Merck drug because its efficacy is very modest. And I still can't explain, Céline, how you could have 50% efficacy, have 7 people per 100 halfway point, and then have everything halved, which means the second half of the trial, there was no effect. That's kind of, and there's no explanation. So that and the concerns about the lethal mutagenesis mechanism, I'm not comfortable with that drug, whether using it alone or even in combination. So as you know, Paxlovid is a combination strategy. It uses the drug that was designed specifically for SARS-CoV-2. So I think this is important because this is the first drug that actually was designed for this virus. Others that have been tried were used, repurposed from other virus remedies or potential remedies. So here we have a specific molecule which takes down the main protease MPRO of the virus, and it works really well against Omicron because there's only one mutation in Omicron from the ancestral strain. So we got a pill that you can take with another pill that raises its blood level, ritonavir, which is an HIV drug, but it's used at very low dose. And now we have this blister pack that should actually have 5 days, taking the two pills twice a day for 5 days, that should take Omicron almost 90% efficacy. You just can't beat that, of avoiding hospitalizations and deaths, not just, preventing illness. The other thing I'm really struck by, Céline, on this is the tenfold by formal analysis, not just by CT cycle threshold of PCR, formal viral copies tenfold reduced with Omicron in both of the trials that they did. So we're going to reduce transmission with these pills. And that's a big deal. When you think about that, for us, the healthcare workers, that you get an Omicron infection, you said you can't go back to work for 10 days, we're going to be short staffed. Well, what if you had a pill that knocked down your transmission really quickly? So what I think is that this is so exciting. And I do think we need a lot more than the 200,000 blister packs that the US has purchased. I expect it will get approved any day before the end of the year. But the approval is one thing, having enough pills. We may have 1 million cases a day or more of Omicron, the way things are headed. And so 200,000 doses or treatment courses isn't going to get us too far.
So, you get at the supply question, and this has been an issue with vaccines too. So there's been a lot of conversation with respect to vaccines about the TRIPS waiver, essentially allowing others to produce with setting aside the intellectual property protections of patents. But that also with vaccines, they're very complicated to manufacture. You really do need to share not just or waive intellectual property rights, but you also need to share the recipe to manufacture vaccines, the manufacturing know-how. Would it be as challenging to share that same know-how to manufacture these pills? And what are some of the ways that we might help expedite that, help more rapidly increase manufacturing and supply here?
Yeah, great question. I've seen what Pfizer plans is 80 million doses by the end of next year. Well, we could go through 80 million doses a lot quicker than that. And since we have, assuming that we don't develop resistance to this pill, which I think is in the near term, that would be far-fetched because it doesn't, this is not a mutation prone area of the virus, unlike the spike protein, as we saw with Omicron. So what I would do is have the Defense Production Act mobilize and have other companies, whether it's the companies that make generics or other pharma companies, make these pills at a scale that's unprecedented. Now, it's a bold act. It's unlike something the White House would do, but that's what I would do. I would make as many freaking millions, hundreds of millions of these pills, billions as we could quickly, and get them in every medicine cabinet in the United States. That's what I would do, because we have a remedy and it doesn't depend on our immune response, and it works, exceedingly well. So that, what you're getting at is that going to happen? No, most likely. Is Pfizer they have agreed that other countries can make the pill, but who knows when that's going to happen. And, this is a problem because we have unwillingness to challenge the pharma company in the midst of a crisis. And since, as you've aptly pointed out, we don't know the full spectrum of Omicron yet. And I already know of a couple of people who had Omicron infections who got pretty darn sick and then were boosted even. That doesn't make me feel better about where we're headed. I mean, they didn't wind up in the hospital, but, they're not doing very well at all. So we do need something urgently, and we have something on the horizon within a matter of days, but it won't be enough supply, and people will, there's going to be the same issues about inequities and short supply that we've seen with the vaccines. It's really unfortunate.
So understanding that there is going to be short supply, at least in the coming months, if not in the coming year, how do we best use that limited supply? Does that mean a form of rationing, a form of prioritization or targeting? And what kind of systems or infrastructure do we need to set up to do all of that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as you well know, we have a jungleoid use of a prescription drug, right? So what's going to happen is the FDA advisors and the FDA are going to say, okay, it's approved for high risk. And then all it takes is getting a prescription. And you know how that can happen. I mean, you can get a prescription through a teledoc or whatever, kind of thing, and you got your prescription and you may not be high risk. So there's ways to work through the system which are not with the same criteria as the FDA approval once it gets into the prescription mode. That's what we're going to see. And, there's going to be, I would predict a jungle-like behavior where people will be stockpiling these blister packs in case they get sick, even not even sick. I mean, because if doctors are willing to be complicit, that's what could happen, right? So this is a real problem. Now, the good thing is the cost is free to the Americans. I mean, that's good. We have no pills to make enough for the Americans, but the ones who get them, it'll be like the vaccines. There's no charge. All right, that's great, because otherwise it would be like $550 for a P-pack. That's a lot of money for a P-pack. So, this is a problem. We don't have a way to put the brakes on how these go out. Maybe you have an idea how we could do that. I don't know.
I mean, I think another issue, right, is you need to treat within 5 days of symptom onset or infection onset for these drugs to really have an impact. I mean, does our healthcare system have the ability to treat somebody that quickly?
Yeah, I was really surprised by that data that you're referring to, Céline, that it worked almost as well or as well at 5 days and 3 days, because the main thing it does is blocks replication of the virus. You'd think by 5 days, that it was pretty far along. We haven't seen all the granular data. We only have the extensive press release. And I hope with the FDA, the good thing is the briefing document will have all the data, even though the manuscript hasn't been published. So I look forward to seeing that. That seemed odd to me. The other thing that seemed odd to me is how the people over 65 had 94% reduction in events. That's great. I mean, but again, they're the high risk people, and they have higher events. This is hospitalizations and deaths, but 94% protection. I mean, that's pretty darn good. I mean, you don't see that very often. So I'm looking forward to seeing more data, but I wonder about this 5-day thing. I just have a hard time explaining it.
Yeah, I was surprised, and part of me was relieved because it had me thinking, well, maybe that gives us a little bit more time if it's real. But if it's real, that's a bit surprising given our experience with oseltamivir or Tamiflu for influenza. You really do need to give it much earlier. What about long COVID? We don't have any good treatments right now for long COVID. The best we can do is really try to prevent infection. We do see decreased odds of long COVID in people who are vaccinated, but it's not zero risk if you have a breakthrough infection and you've been vaccinated. Do these drugs, does Paxlovid in particular, have potential with respect to preventing people from progressing to long COVID or as a treatment for long COVID?
Yeah, that's a good one. I wish we knew the answer, but some speculation. Firstly, I think Omicron could give us a much tougher time with long COVID. One is because we're going to have so many more cases. And as you well know so well, mild cases can lead to long disabling symptoms in people. It doesn't have to be a severe case or even a moderate one. The second thing, though, is because it evades our immune system, and there's something about it we don't understand about long COVID, where we have this kind of persistent activation of our immune system. That's not a good combination. This virus, this strain version, and what we have seen with previous variants and long COVID. Now, the question, of course, is if you can stop this in its tracks with a pill early, yeah, you would think, I think the data for the monoclonal antibodies, when they are given early, neutralizing the virus, I'm not aware of much long COVID in that group. So I'm hoping that would be simulated by the pill intervention, but we'll have to find out. I think we could agree Omicron is a formidable challenge, but there again brings in the early side. If we wait many days before we do anything with any intervention, that has already been a trigger, and that's not a good thing.
Last question for you, Eric, before we open it up to the whole group. Is there anything else on the horizon for long COVID that seems promising? Any other treatment approaches, or perhaps it's just better understanding of the pathogenesis of long COVID?
Yeah, man, that's the biggest thing, is we still don't get that right. We don't know yet. There's like a mosaic of some people it's much more immunologic. Some people it seems to be, a kind of a different cluster of symptoms. The only thing that seems to have some effect is that if you're vaccinated, the chance of you, when you have a breakthrough infection, is lower, maybe half, maybe 30% lower. We don't know. There's several studies, but which again, that is helpful, but it's not a treatment. We just don't have a darn treatment. And these people, so many I know, are just very severely disabled. I'm sure you know many too, and to not have anything to offer except a multidisciplinary clinic to deal with all the symptoms, that's not good. So we haven't yet even come up with a candidate treatment, which is discouraging, except for like treating the fast heart rate or things like that. But we haven't gotten down to dealing with the immune system being disrupted with a kind of constant persistent response. So I hope we'll come up with something.
Well, thank you, Eric. This was fun. I guess we're opening it up to the full group for Q&A as well.
Yes, thank you. So everyone feel free to turn your videos back on, and Aaron and I will be fielding questions that are coming in live as well as those submitted in advance. So we will kick it off with this interesting question. Several of you have mentioned the role of T cells in helping to deter severe disease and hospitalization. And we have an audience member wondering, can we measure our T cells? Is there a test accessible? We know that it's very different from measuring antibodies. What is the status of testing for T cells?
No, you cannot. You cannot test for T cells, unfortunately. You need a lab, a specialized lab even, to do that type of work. And I would also point out that it's a good opportunity to say that the commercial tests measuring antibodies do not necessarily measure your neutralizing antibodies. They measure total antibody levels. They also, each individual test, depending on what company it's produced from, has a completely different scale and means different things. They don't necessarily correspond to your neutralizing antibodies. So they're good to tell you whether you have antibodies or not, but I wouldn't take them at face value to say, oh, I have really high levels of antibodies and I'm fine. People have to be very, very careful about this.
So is there any meaningful measurement out there right now for someone's immunity?
I mean, as I said, an antibody test can tell you whether you have antibodies against spike or N, but spike are the ones that you're would be most interested in. But, and as I said, it's just a plus or minus. If they are high, yes, it's probably a bit better, but you can't say, oh, my level is that in that test, therefore I am protected. This is not a direct correlation.
Got it. Another question. What will it take, for example, a certain low rate of hospitalizations or infections, a low severity of infections for COVID-19 to become societally like a cold or a flu with which we live all the time, but which we don't shut down our lives through quarantines or workplace or school shutdowns after positive diagnoses?
Yeah, so I kind of rattled off some of those numbers. Again, what we're dealing with now in the US is over 50,000 hospitalizations per week and 7,000 deaths per week. That was earlier this month from COVID. If you compare that to other respiratory viral illnesses like the flu, like RSV, which we have come to live with, in a bad flu season, bad RSV year, you would be looking at 35,000 hospitalizations per week, 3,000 deaths per week. So we're already at about twice that much just from COVID alone. And then you have to, of course, add on to that flu and RSV. But I think many Americans have decided that's okay. And they're willing to live with that. I think this is really not a scientific question. It's a question of what are people willing to live with? How many deaths in their community, in their families, among their loved ones, are they willing to live with? And I think what's challenging with COVID is that it is not evenly distributed. And so there are some communities that have been largely unscathed. There are other communities that have been hit very hard. And so that perception of risk is going to vary by community. But to give you, again, putting those numbers on it, we would need to cut where we are from where we were at the beginning of the month, cut that in half to match what we were already suffering with from flu and RSV. So that would still, even if you cut our current COVID numbers in half, that would still mean an overall essential doubling of your viral respiratory illness, disease, and death.
Okay, thank you for that question. I would like to ask a question I think that is extremely timely for probably most of the people, if not everyone in attendance. Are you, as experts on this topic, going to be changing your behavior around holiday plans this year because of Omicron or not?
I had no holiday plans, so.
I'm with Theodora on that. Yeah, we just have our family here, so it makes it easy. And even then, we're going to be very, very careful. We have Omicron over 20% in San Diego right now.
Yeah, what I've done is, I think I've been pushing harder for boosters. I think there was a lot of holdouts among even some of my friends who were really, really concerned about the global vaccine equity and felt like getting a booster was, not really the best thing to do from a conscience standpoint. But I think Omicron has really changed a lot of things. And, so just encouraging most people to get boosted. And also, I think we need to dial back a little bit with regards to just lots of things we'd stop doing. And I think that makes total sense till we see how things play out.
Yeah, I would echo that. My family, our immediate family that we're celebrating the holidays with this year. We're all fully vaccinated. Everyone except the 2-year-old who's not yet eligible. The 6-year-old is fully vaccinated, but not boosted because it's been too short of an interval. Everyone else, since the emergence of Omicron, has gotten boosted. And then we'll be layering other interventions. So making use of HEPA air filtration units. My sister who's hosting has one in every, the kitchen, the living room, the dining room, opening doors and windows, doing some things outdoors with the kids, which it's an unseasonably warm winter in many parts of the country right now. So that makes it a lot easier. We're also going to make use of testing before we travel. There are some concerns about how well the rapid tests are working with Omicron, so I'm not going to rely completely on that. I think we're also going to look at PCR testing until we have a little bit more information on the rapid tests in the context of Omicron. And then during travel, masking, wearing N95 respirators in the airport and on the plane. Not taking off the mask to eat or drink on the plane. So last year we did not celebrate together. This year we are, but we're doing so in a very tight-knit group and layering a lot of different protections.
Thank you. Is herd immunity even a consideration at this point, when vaccines are not able to prevent transmission fully, but instead are protecting from severe disease? Wouldn't we expect continued viral transmission even in a population of entirely vaccinated individuals?
Yes, I think we would. So I don't know. I think our chance to achieve herd immunity is gone.
Zero.
We're over it.
Yeah, we got to file that term. It doesn't, not even remotely possible.
I think what we're looking at is eventually a transition from epidemic to endemic. But I think a lot of these terms have really been misused over the course of the pandemic, whether it's herd immunity or more recently endemic. It's really meant to say, let's give up, let's just let this run through the population. It's not worth fighting, which I really disagree with that sentiment. I think just to briefly illustrate the difference between epidemic and endemic, in some ways, I think about it as the shape of the curve. So an epidemic curve does this. You have these big spikes and surges in disease. Endemic is more like ripples in a pond, where you have ongoing community transmission, but you don't have those huge spikes. But if you look at our case curve right now, we are far from an endemic pattern if we ever get there. We are still very much in the epidemic phase of this. And the fastest way to get from here to an endemic pattern would really be to vaccinate a whole lot more people. But we've really stalled out at 60% fully vaccinated in the United States and have had a very hard time increasing those numbers.
Yeah, I just would add, and some really important comments. I like to use the word containment. And the reason I use that is we have an example at the end of May in the United States when we actually achieved containment. We were down below 30,000 cases a day, down getting close to 10,000. That was really great. It lasted for a few days. But, if you look at Japan, they have that now. They're in, down to very low levels. In Israel, they're down to those levels right now. If we can get to containment, that we should stop talking about, other terms. That would be all we could ask for, because as Céline points out, we're not having surges. We're not at 120,000 on the way to 1 million cases a day. We're at that's what we should hope for. And that's what we can achieve. We know we can achieve that, but it really gets down to the point Theodora made earlier, is we have such resilient willingness of human behavior. That behavior extends to getting a vaccine, no less, making believe there's no pandemic. How can you achieve containment when you have people that just ignore everything, including the science, including what we know works? We're in the same shoes as we were in the beginning of 2020. It's a respiratory virus. We know how to deal with it, but we're not doing it. We just think this stuff, we're tired. We're just, we've given up. Mea culpa to the virus. That's just horrible.
So we've heard you loud and clear that I think one of the big take-home messages from this whole event has been get your booster shot, right? We do have a question from a panelist asking if you were infected with the original virus, and then you had 2 doses of Pfizer in the spring, do you need a booster as well?
Good question. We don't know. Maybe. We really don't know about that category. So perhaps.
Is there any harm? I'll just follow up and asking, is there any harm in someone getting a booster shot who may not absolutely need one?
I think that everyone will agree with me that they've proven so safe, these vaccines, particularly the mRNA, unless, as Céline mentioned, you are allergic to one of the components, that I personally don't see the harm, but always obviously discuss this with your doctor and make sure that it's okay.
I agree.
Great. Is it true that from the point of view of the virus's own survival, evolutionary logic suggests that the most successful variants will have higher transmissibility and lower mortality of the host? Do you think that's where the early data on Omicron are getting?
No.
No.
I mean, I think we are anthropomorphizing the virus a bit too much. The virus doesn't have an agenda. The virus just transmits, multiplies, and makes trillions and trillions of copies of itself. And the mutations are random. And when a mutation is advantageous, it will prevail. Usually, at least thus far, the mutations have been avoidance of the greatest barrier we have thrown against it, which is our antibodies. So that's what the virus is doing. The virus doesn't know whether it's going to be more transmissible, less transmissible, more lethal or less lethal. It just does what it does at random, and we are selecting which ones are going to fare better. So I don't think that we can rely on the fact that Omicron will be less lethal because the virus, it's in the interest of the virus.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Erin, I mean, to this, we have this tendency to anthropomorphize the virus and give it human qualities. It doesn't have a brain, okay? We have brains, but we're not using them. So this idea about less mortality, we have nothing to substantiate that about the virus. We keep assigning stuff to the virus instead of the people. Yes, there's less mortality, sure, because we have immunity walls all over the world, even in places like South Africa with 25%. That's still, and a lot of prior COVID, that's a big immunity wall. That's why we're seeing less death. People just keep, oh, the virus is more mild. No, we have a brain. We need to use our brain.
Yeah, all I'll just add is I think that at least what's been clear with the viral evolution so far, especially with those that have evolved to overtake numbers wise, has just been increased transmissibility, right? You could easily predict that if Delta was circulating and then there was this new variant that became a problem, that it was going to be more transmissible. So I think, the question is, how far can that go, right? Could there be another variant that even exceeds Omicron? Your guess is as good as mine. So certainly the transmissibility issue is something that's fueling these variants as they emerge. But I totally agree that the virus isn't planning to be more virulent or less virulent, and we just have to see what the clinical outcomes are. And when we look also at the clinical outcomes, we need to look at the different populations. The population in South Africa may be younger, but they also have high rates of HIV, et cetera, what vaccines are prevalent in those countries that are being used, which may be a little different from other parts of the world. So I think we'll all be paying attention to that. And also, just one last thing to add is, in the US, right? So we now have great pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, treatment. We're talking about pills. So I don't think would even be the best environment to look at important outcomes like hospitalizations and deaths, because I hope that we use the tools that we have, right, to mitigate some of those endpoints people will be looking at. So we may have to learn some of those important questions from other parts of the world.
Can any of the panelists comment on whether other countries like Israel, who started rolling out their booster shots months ago, do we know anything about how long those are holding up or how well those are lasting?
we only have the earliest data that it may not be as hoped. First it was suggested maybe it could be 10 months, a year, but there seems to be some early signs of slippage, as early as 3 to 4 months. So we'll have to see how that, the Ministry of Health in Israel does a lot of great data dissemination and makes it available for the science community for analysis. And some of those analyses suggest that now that they're getting to be close to 4 months out, that they're seeing the same thing they saw back in July. Okay, so with the 2 shots. So we'll see. But I wouldn't be surprised that it's not, we really 4 months is where the waning took place for infection. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 4 months again, based on what I've seen.
So I think that touches, I forget who mentioned it, either Onyema or Céline, what do we expect from the vaccines? So they will not stop transmission. That's an incredibly high goal to set for any vaccine. And we know that the responses will wane, particularly neutralizing antibodies. But if your memory is diversified enough, then upon reinfection, you will be able to deal even with a new variant. So we have to rely on, I think we are relying on memory response lately, and mainly on some of the antibodies that are left over. We have to think that those will be sufficient.
And this is where your vaccination strategy may also differ depending on the population. There are certain populations where maybe you do want to boost frequently, maybe once a year, maybe it's a nursing home population, nursing home residents, maybe it's healthcare workers, so that you're reducing the risk of them getting sick, transmitting onward. But I don't think that that is going to be the goal at the population level, to suppress all infection with repeated boosters. I don't think that's going to be a feasible public health approach.
So just as a quick follow-up, and this will be our last question because we're out of time. It seems like maybe we should all just prepare to eventually have what we will hope is a breakthrough that's mild. Is it actually something that could be beneficial for our bodies to be reminded of the virus in a setting in which we're protected, hopefully boosted, and then kind of topped up by exposure? Or should we still continue, in the longer term to try to avoid as much as we can?
Well, I don't think we're ready to have chickenpox parties with Omicron. We just don't know what this is all about yet. We're 3 weeks into the first report. And the concerns about, giving a purposeful exposure, which I guess you're kind of intimating about, are we all going to get this, just surrender and then hope? No, I think that we have too much unpredictability. We just don't know. And to have, if we knew, maybe we'll have that certainty in the months ahead that there's nothing to this infection with Omicron. That'd be a different story, but we sure don't know that now. And I think it's highly unlikely.
No, absolutely. Of course, everyone who's able to get a booster, that seems to be the main message, and to continue with mitigation, ventilation, testing where you can, being careful around the holiday season as much as possible. So
we're out of time, and I want to thank our wonderful panelists on behalf of the Aspen Institute and leaps.org for sharing your time, your experience, your expertise. This was extremely informative. We have recorded this. It will be on YouTube either later today or sometime tomorrow, and we'll send out the link to all registrants. So thank you everyone for your participation, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Kira and Aaron, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks.
All the best.